So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the British Embassy. I'm Michael Tatham, the acting ambassador to the US, and it's a pleasure to see you all. And it's a pleasure to be partnering once again with the National Science Foundation and Axios in tonight's event. This is the second of a series of events aiming to explore some of the big technological, economic, and policy challenges that confront us in a rapidly changing world. Our first event covered the future of mobility. Tonight's theme tackles a challenge which will impact all sectors of society, from government and business to research and the general public: clean growth. So a big thank you to our panelists and moderator. They bring together expertise on this subject from across business, government, and the media. And my goal is to hand over to them as soon as possible. But I would first like to offer a few framing reflections on the theme of clean growth and the broader context of climate change. Firstly, climate change illustrates a fundamental point about policy making in the modern era. At the end of the 19th century, a British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, described UK foreign policy as being to float lazily downstream, occasionally putting out a diplomatic boat hook to avoid collisions. And this gives a rather enticing picture of a very leisurely and controlled approach to foreign policy, which I struggle to recognize 130 or so years later, because today, as individual nations, we are increasingly subject to powerful external factors that shape our circumstances, whether we like it or not. We cannot insulate ourselves from these global trends, and climate change represents the most enduring and long-term global challenge of all. It confronts us with the necessity of expanding our horizons and thinking not just nationally or even regionally, but globally. And that in turn places a requirement on the international community as never before to find ways of acting together. Climate change also forces us to think in a whole new way about the world. As a government official, I'm very used to thinking in time frames: financial years, electoral terms, business cycles, and so on. Time frames that generally last between about 1 and 5 years. But climate change requires us to think in a radically different timescale. Our actions today will determine the future in decades' time, a message which some young demonstrators have been making in a pointed way by wearing T-shirts saying, "How old will you be in 2050?" The scale of this challenge can seem daunting and intimidating, and as we saw at COP25, the international community is still falling short in terms of urgency and collective resolve. For the UK, we understand the responsibility that places on us as hosts of COP26 to regalvanize international efforts, and 5 years on from the Paris Agreement, to put ourselves on track to deliver on its ambitious but very necessary goals. The UK wants to lead by example, hence our decision to apply net zero targets for the year 2050 and to enshrine these in law. The good news is that we don't need to think in terms of a binary choice between tackling climate change on the one hand and generating or sustaining economic growth on the other. The two can go hand in hand. We can limit the extent of climate change for future generations at the same time as we deliver economic growth for current generations. In the UK, we've managed to reduce emissions by over 40% since 1990, while the overall economy has grown considerably. Now, that is in large part due to moving away from coal, which is something you can only do once. But increased technological capacity means that new opportunities are opening up, which will allow us to sustain this path. Carbon-free technologies, energy efficiency, and a green financial system are all innovations with enormous potential. Earlier this week, during the National Governors Association, I met 3 governors in quick succession, representing 3 very different states and governors of different political persuasions, but all of them highly focused on the potential for renewable energy in their states, whether solar, offshore, or onshore wind. I'm going to betray my age now, but I remember as a schoolchild growing up in the 1970s in the UK, and there was a strong sense of optimism about the UK's offshore oil and gas reserves and how those would drive our economy forward in the period ahead. I'm struck now by how 5 decades later, there's the same sense of energy optimism about the UK's offshore potential, but now in terms of renewable energy rather than oil and gas. So however daunting the challenge of tackling climate change, the potential for driving forward the clean growth agenda means that it is a challenge we can tackle not just in the spirit of necessity, but also of opportunity and creativity. And on that buoyant note, I will hand over to Ben, our moderator, to start the panel discussion. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for being here. I think those remarks framed the discussion we're going to have very well. So I think I'll immediately introduce our panelists. So I'll start here. We have Jason Kelly, the co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks. We have Michelle Patron, the Director of Sustainability Policy for Microsoft, and Julian Critchlow, the Director General of Energy Transformation and Clean Growth. So thank you again. And just real quick, I think this is a really exciting topic, but it's also some things that have been in the headlines just over the last 24 hours, certainly over the last few weeks, make this a great time to have this discussion, and hopefully we'll take it into some interesting directions. So, Julian, I wanted to start with you. The UK, I believe, is a little over 2 years into a fairly ambitious clean growth strategy, but that's also a kind of broad and somewhat amorphous term. I wonder if you could share with us how you see the idea of clean growth and what some of the early lessons you've learned just, again, a couple years into this broad strategy so far.
Thank you, Ben. We are very much at the start of this transition. Although the targets was set initially with the Climate Change Act back in 2008, what we've seen is the most dramatic changes in probably the last 3 or 4 years, and that has been in the power sector. So if you just take what we've achieved, we've actually moved from a situation where we were about 40% coal 4 or 5 years ago to around 2%. We've moved to just over 50% carbon-free generation. But more important is the opportunity that the ambassador referred to, which was we've actually created a industry in the offshore industry that didn't really exist probably 4 or 5 years ago, and was priced at way above the price of conventional thermal generation. So at something like £115 per megawatt hours just 4 or 5 years ago. And it's come down through the auction process that we've been running on a very regular basis, putting out a very regular 2 gigawatts of capacity each year. We've actually managed to move that down to around £40 per megawatt hour. So that is the kind of scale of the transition that technology can go through. We've always seen it in many different markets. But it now means we have an option with offshore wind, which is below the cost of thermal generation in the UK. So £50 to £60 is typically our price. So that has completely transformed the sector, moved coal off the system for us, and we are now looking at an opportunity to continue to grow that to around 30 gigawatts over the next few years. So a dramatic, creating a load of jobs, as the ambassador described, which are offshore jobs, and ultimately we see those as replacing some of the historic offshore jobs in exploration and production for oil and gas.
Yeah, energy transition is supposed to be slow, I suppose, until it's not, right? I mean, haven't you very recently gone a full 2 weeks with zero coal on the grid?
Absolutely. It is stunning to see the rate of the transition. But it is, I think, a testament to what industrial companies can do if they're given certainty over what the future looks like. So it's not something that the government is doing. We've obviously tried and innovated and tried lots of different regulatory models, but ultimately once we found one, it allowed investors to come in with certainty to build factories, spread them over a long period of time, produce supply chains, scale those to bring down the costs, and actually the innovation that's come in the way of constructing the wind farms, the scale of the wind farms, is all part of what's driving the cost down at such an incredible rate.
Definitely, and I know that Microsoft, of course, has been one of the larger corporate buyers of renewable energy, of wind and solar. But Michelle, I wanted to ask you, often when we think of the term climate friendly or clean growth, we immediately discussion does very quickly go to the energy industry. But I'm wondering what that term means for one of the largest technology companies in the world, and what role does Microsoft have to play in that? I know we've seen some quite aggressive recent announcements.
Yeah, I mean, for Microsoft, it really starts with the science and the math. And we see what is happening in the world, and we see that emissions are continuing to rise, and we see that the impacts are being felt today. And so we need to be grounded in that to understand what we can do for ourselves and then what we can do for our customers. Our customers operate in every single sector of the economy, private sector, public sector. And so they're also looking for solutions to help with their transitions. And so the announcement that we just did was that by 2030, Microsoft is going to be carbon negative, and we're going to be carbon negative against all our emissions. The first level of emissions, which is called Scope 1, which is our direct emissions think of our buildings, right? Anything that you are directly responsible. Scope 2 is your electricity, so the emissions that come from all the electricity that you use. For us, that's to power our data centers and to power our buildings and to power our campuses. And most importantly, we're also looking at Scope 3. That is everything in our supply chain. Think of that from, consultants to desks, to all of the emissions that come from the vehicles that take our products and the ships that take our products from their manufacturing plants to their stores and to their end users. It also includes the electricity that our customers use when they're using our devices. So it's both upstream and downstream. And for most companies, that is the biggest chunk of emissions. So we're going to get that to as near zero as possible, and what we can't get to near zero, we're going to remove from the atmosphere. And we're going to keep going until we get to our big ambitious goal, which is by 2050 to remove all the historic emissions that Microsoft has put into the atmosphere since we were founded in 1975. And that goes back to the idea that we've been doing a lot. We know a lot of people, a lot of companies are doing a lot. They're buying renewable energy. They're doing things to avoid emissions. But we need to do things that also remove emissions to get us to that net zero base in which we can, have a sustainable climate.
And what type of, so I think your direct operations, that's fairly easy to kind of conceptualize, and your energy supply, that's fairly easy to conceptualize. Scope 3 and how your products are used in the economy, that's much more difficult to get at least my head around. What are some examples of how you can work either through your supply and value chain or in other ways to both create some metrics around what your Scope 3 emissions even are, and what are some kind of tangible ways that you can actually sort of say, okay, not only are we addressing 1 and 2, but here's, ways A, B, or C that we actually provide, ensuring that we're getting our Scope 3 down.
Absolutely. And Ben, you put your finger on two of the biggest problems. One is that for everyone's supply chain, even as an individual consumer, you don't control it, right? Yep. And so how do you reduce it? And how do you even measure it? And how do you help your vendors and your manufacturers measure it? So those are two of the biggest challenges. For us, what we set is a goal for 2030 to get our Scope 3 emissions down by 55%. For everyone to know, that's about 12 million metric tons. That's what our Scope 3 emissions are roughly around right now. And so the first things we're looking at is Microsoft has instituted a carbon fee. We charge all of our businesses right now $15 per metric ton for all of the emissions that the business units. Then we then take that money and we reinvest it in carbon reduction activities that help us meet our goals. So think of it as a fee and fund model. We've been doing that for 5 years. It's helped our businesses think differently about the decisions they're making and help them have some skin in the game, but also created a fund for us to be able to make these investments. We are now going to apply that carbon fee to our supply chain. And so we are going to institute the same kinds of things so that it tries to trigger changes in behavior, but it also is going to help us fund programs to work with our suppliers. The second thing is that in the next year, we're going to be rolling out new procurement guidance in which we are going to help equip our suppliers to begin to measure and to begin to report, because that is the first kind of activity that we all have to do before we can know how we can manage it better.
Thank you. And Jason, I was watching a recent interview you did, and you said that you said that biology can transform all industries, which is a very bold claim. And so I'd like to get a sense of what does synthetic biology and what does Ginkgo's various different product lines and businesses, what does that mean for clean growth, and what are some of the ways in which your company can sort of lower the carbon footprint, and if the science is right, and it is right, we need to get it vastly lower and very soon.
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, I think I'm sort of up here as the fast-growing tech company trying to work on problems in this area. So the White House held a bioeconomy summit about 3 or 4 months ago now. This is a follow-on to similar summits in AI and quantum, and it's around this technology of synthetic biology. And what I think is interesting is people kind of know what AI is. They generally have a sense of quantum, and everybody's like, what the heck is synthetic biology? And so I'm happy to give like a little bit of a primer. So the basic idea is we're going to program cells like we program computers because they run on digital code in the form of DNA, right? So it's A, T, C's, and G's, not zeros and ones, but you can read it with DNA sequencing. So you might have heard of like the Human Genome Project back in 2000. That's DNA reading. And then DNA writing or DNA synthesis is the printing of DNA. So you type A, T, C, G, G in a computer, you hit print, and out of a big machine, Ginkgo happens to be the largest user of this technology, about 25% worldwide DNA printing is designed by us. You get that DNA you asked for. And then you compile it, you put it into the genome of a cell, you grow that cell up, it reads the code, and it does something new as a result. And so to give you an example of a couple products that would be relevant in the kind of clean tech space, you might have heard of like the Impossible Burger, right? So this is now like rolled out nationwide as the Impossible Whopper. It's a veggie burger. You bite into it, and it bleeds. Well, where's the blood coming from, right? There's not a lot of blood in plants. What Impossible's done is they've taken the gene for hemoglobin, right? So the code, all right, the A, T, C's, and G's that encode that heme gene, which is what makes your blood red, and cow's blood red. And they take that gene, they print it, they put it into the genome of brewer's yeast, like the yeast you would use to make beer. They brew it up, except instead of beer coming out, heme comes out. You add it to what's otherwise, sort of a traditional veggie burger. It smells right, it cooks right. I'm not a vegetarian, I'm a meat eater, and it doesn't taste like cardboard to me, okay, right? And so that's a consequence of these sort of product otherwise you wouldn't be able to get without programming a cell to make this otherwise unavailable material heme and add it in there. Does that make sense as a concept? And just one other sort of practical example, we at Ginkgo has a $100 million joint venture with Bayer Crop Science. This is the biggest ag biotech company in the world to work on fertilizer production. So the way we get nitrogen fertilizer today, so I was a chemical engineer by training, this is like the pride of chemical engineering, it's called Haber-Bosch. You basically pull atmospheric gas through a big chemical plant, and the atmosphere is 70% nitrogen. You burn natural gas, 4% global natural gas goes to doing this, and you add the nitrogen in the air plus the hydrogen in the gas, and you get ammonia. You bag it up, you ship it to farmers, you put it on a field, they put it on a field, half goes to the crop, half goes in the river. You get a local environmental problem, you get a global greenhouse gas problem, but we all get to eat, right? There are certain crops, like soybeans, that you don't really need to fertilize much, and the reason is they have microbes on their roots running Haber-Bosch. They're pulling nitrogen out of the air and they're fertilizing the crop, like operating like little miniature fertilizer factories right there in the soil for free, okay? No emissions doing that, right? And so what about corn, wheat, and rice? Those are half of global fertilizer usage. $80 billion a year, they don't have these microbes. So Bayer wants us to do is read the genetic code from that soybean microbe, redesign it, and program the microbe that lives on corn, so you could apply it as a seed treatment, plant that corn seed, and ultimately wean corn off of fertilizer, right? So I bring these things up because I also think there's like a little bit of an element in the climate thing of, it's a big problem, feels like a hopeless problem. I do think there are certain technologies, and I'm obviously a biased big believer in synthetic biology, but I think there are emerging engineering technologies that offer some solutions to this. This is just an example of one of them, of many new technologies I think that could help.
But it's so refreshing that we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about biology and we're talking about all these other sectors, because climate change is about everything, and it's about every business looking at this in such a different way and figuring out how this impacts them and where the opportunity is for them. It too often gets stuck in this energy debate. Correct. And it's really exciting to hear about what's happening in the ag space, or what's happening in the forestry space, or what's happening in the retail space, because there is so much dynamic energy.
Yeah, Walmart did a sort of a carbon survey of this, and they found that the biggest emitter was the fertilizer being used to make the food they sold, right? And so and you do have to get all the way back into that, or else you're not accounting for it. I think Microsoft sort of, I love like start with math. That's exactly right. But go back and
it's
join the club. Yeah.
It's exciting, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. And Julian, I'd like to steer this back to you. Just yesterday evening, the International Energy Agency came out with some data showing that, based on their best estimates, energy-related carbon dioxide emissions were flat in 2019. And if you kind of look at this just right and squint at this just right, you could say, okay, sure, this is good news. That there was a bit of a false dawn about 5 years ago. We thought emissions had plateaued, then they started going back up again. But climate policy and climate change has been in the public eye, and there's been some level of policy for quite a long time now. We've had an immense amount of huffing and puffing to get to what may not even be a plateau, but hopefully now we've seen a plateau. So I guess my question is, given the deep and steep carbon emissions reductions necessary to sort of, even if 1.5 degrees is kind of slipping out of reach, even to get to 2, given what's necessary, is clean growth, is growth even the best model, right? I mean, can we continue to grow? How feasible is it to continue to grow and get to those very steep types of emissions reductions that are necessary in the context of the fact that, again, as I just mentioned, immense amount of huffing and puffing just to get to what may be a plateau?
Well, I suppose I'd take slight issue with Jason's comments, but only slight, in the sense that back in 2008, when the UK committed to taking out 80% of the greenhouse gases from the territorial emissions, we looked at that and estimated the cost that would cost, and there was a net cost to the economy. Some of the technologies, we weren't altogether certain they were existing, but we could see a way to getting to 80%. There was a pathway. When we went back in June last year, we got the independent advice of the Committee on Climate Change, which was a great feature of the legislation, to have somebody independent who advised on it, and actually looked at it again, and their estimates were, and we agreed with those estimates running our own models, was that, again, you could achieve zero by 2050 using existing technologies. You could see the technology path all the way to 2050 that would get there for no more cost than it had cost in 2008 to hit 80%. So in a sense, we said it's feasible. There is a small cost, but it is feasible. It's a huge transition, and we can see technologies all the way down. However, we think that the innovation that we've seen since 2008 that has brought the cost down in all the areas like Jason described will accelerate and will bring the cost of the transition down, and will develop a whole new set of industries. So we think that the opportunity is there, and that is why we were willing to legislate for net zero by 2050. So I think the power system is just one. The whole energy system, the next big frontier is going to be transport. It's 27% of the UK's emissions that remain. It's the largest sector now that we've got power down from what used to be about a quarter of the emissions. But it is the next big thing for us, is to be able to take the transport system and do that. And then we have to go sector by sector through heating, which is 34% of our emissions in the UK, industry, and then agriculture. And then go up, like Microsoft have done, all the way up our supply chain. So we think it's feasible. We think it can be done without bearing a huge amount of cost, and it will create huge new opportunities similar to the offshore, similar to some of the biotech.
I would just say that getting to a flat state still means that we are emitting 50 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. That we just continue to put that out there. And it continues to, as the ambassador said, it continues to sit there for decades and decades and decades. And so it's about leveling it out, but then we got to get it down. So we're removing removing it from the atmosphere. And I think that is also a really exciting debate and discussion that is just finally coming into the public space about how do we remove this carbon. And those are going to have a lot of growth opportunities too. They're going to be nature-based opportunities if it's in the soil. Measures that probably tie to some of the synthetic work that Jason's working on, but also the afforestation and reforestation in the right ways. But there's also going to be engineering solutions to it, if it's bioenergy carbon capture, or if it is direct air capture, which literally sucks carbon from the air and runs it through a filter, if you will. Those technologies may exist, but they exist at such a high price point, and they're not scalable yet. And that's where a lot of attention, both in the private and the public sector, needs to be.
So how confident are you then? I mean, so you've got internally you've said, well, actually very publicly, Microsoft has set this kind of firm deadline, right, 2030. But you also mentioned that technologies on negative emissions many of them are either at an extraordinarily high price point or at an early stage of development, or both. How can you be sure you're going to hit that target?
We're not. It's a moonshot for us. That's what our leaders, our CEO, our CFO, our president stood up there on January 16th and said this is a moonshot for us and it needs to be for the world. But we need to start somewhere. So we need to help on the procurement and finding out what is out there. We announced a $1 billion innovation fund that we're going to be looking at, where we can invest, if it's debt or if it's equity or project financing on these things that exist today, but helping get the cost down, or on the things that are coming from the lab that need to be able to get to market. And $1 billion is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
We need a lot of other people to come into this space, and that we're going to work on the digital tools that help our customers track their emissions and help them begin to figure out how to manage them and transform their own business and products there. So, but we have to have a North Star that we can organize around. And, Bill Gates came out, and how many years ago was it? 40 years ago, and said he was going to put a PC on everyone's desk. And that seemed like a moonshot then. So this is our moonshot now.
Yeah, maybe. So I think this idea that it's in tension with growth is dangerous. Dangerous idea.
Sorry, what's the dangerous idea?
You brought up that, hey, it's clean growth. Is it? Are these in tension? Is the fact that we are growing is that the origin of the problem? The economies are growing and our technology is growing, and I think it's a mistake to go in that direction, in my opinion. Because I think if you look at, I'm an engineer, right? If you look, take electric cars, it's a great example. Electric cars are just better than combustion engines. It's not a compromise. They are better products, right? They have fewer moving parts. They break down less. You don't need to stop at a gas station, right? It is just a better. They accelerate faster. They're cooler, they're just better products. Better products.
They have games.
Right, and it so happens, right, that electric engine is more efficient, right, at converting energy into motion. So we ought to just all be using electric cars. That could happen tomorrow, right? Now there's a thing to get over to do that. There's a capital trade-off, right? We need to somehow spend all that money, and we have all these existing assets, and those aren't going to, So I get all that, but we don't need to compromise on transportation to switch to electrification. Absolutely. So I think the same thing goes for heating, right? Heat pumps are fine, right? They're more efficient, right? So there actually are better things out there. There's just a big upfront cost to deploying them. It's a big engineering project. Historically, we've been able to pull off big engineering projects, especially in the United States. We did the Manhattan Project, we did the Apollo Project, right? What's wrong with big engineering projects? We can do big engineering projects, and when we treat it like the solution's not out there, solution's out there. You just need capital and a will to do it. And we need to inspire people with the growth that will be created to make it happen, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point.
We've seen this game plan before, yes? We saw this back, if you go back to when our emissions in the UK were at the level they are today, it was 1888, which was just during the Industrial Revolution. And we saw exactly the same quantum leap in terms of the technologies that we're doing. We obviously with a lot of fossil fuel generating equipment, but it transformed the economy from an agrarian to an industrial economy. We saw the levels of investment, to Jason's point, the level of investment, we had to double our national income that was invested in those, but it resulted in a doubling of our productivity and a doubling of the growth rate in the economy and a load of exports of that technology around the world. So there are, I think, huge opportunities from this transition, but it did mean that people had to move from fields to cities in that case, and in this case there's going to be a lot of transitions in every home, every business, every industry, every field. All of these are going to have to transition if we're going to get rid of all the carbon.
But a lot of that can be done, it's fair to say, with a lot of greater deployment of existing technologies at scale, right? I mean, it seems to me sometimes one of the dangers of the discussion around climate change, particularly in the US, is this constant idea that, we're not ready yet, if we innovate, we'll get to these technologies. I mean, it seems to me that the risk, but when you talk a lot about, not you specifically right now, but in the general discussion of technology investment, there's sometimes a risk, I think, of, in a sense, giving comfort to the incumbent technologies and industries because you're saying, okay, well, this next thing is not over the horizon, but not ready for deployment yet. But I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, and before I hop back into a few more. So, are there any? We've got some microphones out here. Are there any questions from the audience? Right here in the front. Oh, there's a mic coming around, sir. Thank you.
In decreasing the production of coal, what happened to the employment in the coal industry? How did you re-employ all those who were previously employed in the coal industry?
So the transition in all of these sectors is going to be has to be carefully managed to be just, because clearly in many countries in the world there are lots of coal miners, and although they might have renewable assets which are cheaper to run, there is an employment issue that you've flagged. In the UK, we obviously had already seen the decline in domestic coal production, so we were traditionally importing. But in something like oil and gas, we've got a very large, around 200,000 people employed in the oil and gas industry in the UK offshore. And so that's kind of an analogy to the coal industry. But what we're seeing is we've already got around 460,000 jobs in the clean economy. They're growing at about 11.5% relative to an economy that's not growing quite as fast as that. And we would expect to, by 2030, have around 2 million people involved in those clean economy jobs. So the art is obviously, firstly, to be able to grow the new jobs faster than the old ones, which relies on having something to often to export. By way of technology, and then supporting the transition for the people in the old legacy roles that will come down. In the case of the offshore industry, a lot of the skills we had for exploration and production for oil and gas are directly relevant to the same offshore skills for putting up the offshore wind farms. So a number of people have moved from one to the other.
Yeah, please follow up.
Yeah, so I've been reading this book, actually. It's the autobiography of Vannevar Bush. He happens to be sort of the fellow that got the NSF going here in the United States, that's sponsoring the event tonight. I should say I'm not affiliated with the NSF, just so you know.
It's a good plug, though.
He talks about how when he was born, which was like in the late 1800s, the country, the United States, was 30% farm workers. Right, 30% of the country had been born on a farm. And he lived through the 2 world wars, the Manhattan Project. He built the scientific sort of industrial complex here in the United States post-war, and was just astounded by the time he was writing this book, which was in the 60s, you had 2% of the population producing 10 times as much food as there had been 50, 60 years earlier. And that's a good thing in the long arc, right? Like, we do need to deal with transitions in the near term for people. That's important, but I think we're all happy that we're not 30% farmers today, right? Like, I think that's a good direction overall. We have to be investing, as a species, as a society, in doing that so we can continue to grow. I think it's important. So those are clear issues, but I think the long arc, people like Vannevar have seen, you got to bet on the technology.
Thank you. I think I saw another question in the, 2 questions in the, one in the second row and one in the third row on this side.
So this may be a really obvious question, but how much is basically this isn't a universal belief that climate change is a serious problem. How much of an impediment is that to all these changes that you're talking about?
I think it's a significant impediment, because if everybody believes in the transition is necessary and happening, then everybody will be investing in the technologies to get to the other side. If half the people don't, or there's mixed understanding of what the impacts will be, then that makes it much harder. So one of the things we're very convinced of is that the more transparency we have of, for instance, all of the scope, all of the different levels of carbon that are created in different supply chains, and how exposed businesses are to some of these climate effects happening, investors and those businesses will be able to make rational decisions. The more it's obscured, or more the lack of transparency stops people making informed decisions. So part of the trying to put more climate financial risks into people's liability sheets and their balance sheets, and actually being able to understand how exposed would they be if these effects continue the rate we've been seeing recently, will provide some of the incentive for people to actually say, okay, so we need to get to the other side.
So I would say public discourse is obviously one factor when it comes to what a company does, but there are a lot of other factors that are coming, and it's what we hear from our investors, which is that climate change is serious. How are you addressing it? It's what we hear from our customers. As I mentioned, we work with customers in the energy sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the agricultural sector. We're working with small cities. We're working with countries around the world we sell our technology to. And they're asking us, they're saying, this is a problem for us. How can your technology help? And we hear it from our employees. Our employees, we work in a very, very tight labor market, trying to attract talent, and climate change is among the most important issue for our employees. And so it's real for them, and they want to know what their company is doing for it and how it aligns with their values. So while the public discourse and how, can definitely help facilitate the types of solutions that are available to addressing it, the other discourses that we're hearing are very powerful and very clear that climate change is serious.
Michelle, if I could very quickly, thank you. If I could very quickly follow up on that question. You mentioned your employees and some of what they're saying and what their views are. One of the criticisms that has come from some employees and outside critics as well is the fact that while the company has these incredibly aggressive climate goals, while you've got an incredibly aggressive, along with some of the other big tech companies, corporate procurement program on renewables, you also have, major contracts with some of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world. You've got a big contract with Exxon to optimize their Permian Basin production, for example. So I guess that's a long-winded way of asking, how do you respond to the criticism that your work in specifically tailoring these very sophisticated computing services to oil industry clients, it runs in opposition to your actual climate goals?
Well, Ben, we've just had a conversation for the last 45 minutes, which is talk about how hard this transition is, and that right now we exist in a carbon-based economy, and we need to get to a zero-carbon economy, and it's going to take everybody and every sector doing that. And so, with all of our customers, it's about helping them meet their business needs today while helping them, transition to their needs for the future, and it's going to take all of us.
I would also say what's not to like. I mean, if you take the fact is, if you take the vehicles or you take the power system, if you can generate power at what the record for solar is $17 per megawatt hour, that's kind of below most marginal cost of generating with a conventional power station. If you've got a car which is lower complexity, doesn't need repairing, is lower cost when it is lower cost, then what's not to like? I think these are on a precautionary principle, if nothing else. Pursuing these vectors makes a lot of sense because they are better in many cases due to innovation and due to very clever engineering. And they, even if they were wrong, if they're lower cost, they're lower cost.
Jason?
And then maybe one thing, I think you can also think of this at the country level, right? The climate change is either going to happen or not. The countries are fundamentally at some level in competition. If you choose to believe it's going to happen and you choose to invest in building an industrial base that is operating in that world and is generating the solutions for that, you're going to own the next 100 years. In the same way, look, the United States brought oil and gas online. That was a pretty big source of power for us, right? If this ends up being the way energy happens, if electrification, all these things happen, you want to be the country that did it, right? And if you were wrong, what's the disadvantage, right? We did the wrong thing for 10 years, big deal. It's another 10 years of a sugar high on burning the stuff in the ground when you could be making an investment in the core technology of the next 100 years. We should be doing it from a national strategic standpoint, in my opinion.
How do you think, given some of the work that your company does with alternative proteins and other consumer-facing or consumer products that people both use and eat, how would all of you assess the way in which the kind of average consumer is going to experience clean growth? Will it be seamless? Will it involve upheaval? Will it involve sacrifice? How should someone who is watching either from the audience or perhaps online, who wants to know, what does clean growth mean for my day-to-day life over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
It's going to be better. It's going to be better tasting veggie burgers and cooler cars, Seriously, look at what's working, right? I think that's true. The big barrier is just an existing sunk cost and depreciated assets and an existing infrastructure that it has better things coming online, but has a bit of, has a moat around it. And that stuff loses on some time scale. So I do think, certainly when it comes to the electrification side, I think energy generation is the trickier one. I don't dispute that. natural gas is cheap, right? So there, I think there's more government issues there. But when it comes to the product side, I honestly think the solutions are already there. It's just an adoption question. It's going to be better products.
I think it's going to be about empowerment. I think that if it's how the electricity system is set up so that you can actually send electricity back, if you can program your appliances to work in a more efficient way, have the option to do that, and somehow make money off of it. What kind of clothes you buy, the fact of the matter that secondhand clothes are now coming back in vogue, and you have all of these department stores in London that have these new areas to sell it. So the options, and so I think it is going to be a different future. But also, I think that the consumers of the future are different. I mean, we see it already. We see what they're asking. We see what they're demanding. We see what they respond to. So it's going to be about changes and empowerment.
Julian, has that been your experience in the UK? I mean, when you talk to both businesses and their customers, do you sense that this is, and we have, as we were discussing earlier, seen what's been a pretty rapid energy transition, at least in the power sector in the UK. Is there apprehension? Is there excitement? How would you sort of assess both the public and the public mood and what you're hearing from the companies that you work with?
Well, I think generically there's a huge amount of advocacy for taking more action. If you look at it over maybe 10 years, you also saw this advocacy rise a bit before the financial crash, and then obviously as people's pockets get hit, they go back to questioning what are the right trade-offs. But actually, it has recovered on a consistent basis year in year, and the advocacy has. And don't forget, we've only done half a degree of warming from 0.5 to 1 degree above the long-term average. We've got another 2, 3, 4 degrees of potential warming if we don't take the action. So we think that the general public interest in this topic and the advocacy will stay. It will go through cycles, but it will be cycles on the way up. So the next question is, do they need to change their behaviors? Well, they haven't really noticed the electrons are coming from offshore wind as opposed to coal plants. So they haven't worried about that. In terms of cars, I mean, it's relatively difficult due to the infrastructure has been to convert. It's going to become easier as we roll more and more infrastructure out. As a family, we've moved to electric vehicles. I've driven twice as many miles as I did with any of my previous cars because it is a better product and I'm still moving from A to B. I'm just not emitting carbon. So we think that if you take power and transport, you can do about half the emissions before people begin to notice. It becomes more challenging when you get down to some food choices, some international travel. Obviously, international travel represents a very significant amount on the average carbon for a single flight. So some of these we may require some behavioral change, but we're also going to try and innovate behind the scenes to try and produce lower carbon versions of the same product at cheaper basis. So I think there will be some, definitely inertia, and there will be some resistance to change, but we have 20, 30 years to achieve that. And certainly the immediate decisions don't require trade-offs in many cases.
Thank you. I want to move to this side of the room I think we've got an audience question in the third row back here, and then the fourth or fifth row back here. Thank you.
So this conversation about trade-offs is interesting. I'm curious to know, in the context of Microsoft, the commitment to making up for historical emissions as well is going to require not just exploring your supply chain and your current activities, but negative emissions of some kind. How are those conversations taking place right now?
What do you mean in terms of calculating what it was?
In terms of, how Microsoft is looking at that landscape, sort of climate restoration broadly. Because, I think some of the conversations around long-haul aviation and so on also touches on the idea that we might need to actually, at some point, remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Absolutely. And that's kind of at the heart. And it's not going to be eventually, it's actually going to be very soon, because even our carbon negative by 2030 requires us to remove carbon. So, we are looking at both nature-based solutions as well as engineering solutions. Nature-based solutions are those that involve afforestation and reforestation and the soil management that we talked before, and the engineering ones are the direct air capture technologies. So we're envisioning both of them. I think that the most important things are going to be making sure that they're verifiable, right? So that making sure that you are literally monitoring and taking the carbon out of the air. They're also going to need to be economically viable for us. So we're still working through these processes about how we're going to go about an RFP and kind of what our initial batch is going to look like. I think we would envision they will be nature-based and they will kind of transition to engineering solutions as those technologies come available. But that's just our procurement piece. Right, and then we have this fund, which is separate capital that we are launching, $1 billion, which will help us, by understanding that landscape, will help us inform the kind of decisions we're going to need to make in our own removal investments.
How quickly will we see disbursements from that fund?
Yes.
Jason, you were going to follow up?
I'm just going to get my card. I will comment on that funding point. So I think it's actually great that you guys are doing the fund because so we're sort of a weird company, right? We did Y Combinator, which is like an incubator in Silicon Valley, like Airbnb and Dropbox and Stripe, and we were the first life science company and really hard tech company to do Y Combinator in summer 2014. And then since then we've raised $800 million, like typical kind of tech company growth scaling thing, right? It's really much more difficult to do that for the hard technology companies. The first 5 years of Ginkgo, we were actually supported by NSF, DARPA, ARPA-E here in the United States, right? Like there just isn't a lot of capital to support the beginnings of this type of technology.
Because for the audience, right, those are the Defense Department's advanced technology programs and the Energy Department's advanced technology.
Yeah, DARPA's they invented the internet, so they get to keep getting money out of the. But these are early stage. They invest in both academic and industrial early stage technology to help them transition to maturity and get into the industry. And there's just a lot of maturity. If you want to do that for an app on your phone, there's more than enough money out there to help you go from an idea to launch in the market. If you were to try to do some new technology in these areas, there's a lot less capital. It's a much harder problem to be a venture capitalist and evaluate the technology. There's a lot of gaps there. And so I think actually this is one of the biggest things I think companies could do is stand up funds specifically to support this type of stuff. There's an enormous amount of latent energy that would be released. Like we're like a very weird case to have like made it out the other side, and it's honestly thanks to U.S. Government support at the beginning.
And the government does tremendous work in this area, and they continue to do. The government does tremendous work in this area. They continue to do tremendous work in this area, and it's a source of.
It's a bit of a failure capital. It's like to look at Tesla and SpaceX. Like those just exist because of just like Elon Musk's largesse, right? Like we shouldn't be counting on like billionaires to get us out the other side of this because, right? Like us passion projects like that. We do have a little bit of a capitalist failing here, I think, and maybe there's some ways to bridge it with things like this. Yeah.
That actually gets to a question I wanted to perhaps save for later, and then I want to return to the audience. But the New Hampshire primary is going on right now.
What's that?
I can ask that.
It's something that people hope won't look like Iowa. I think it's
technology could help there.
But this is certainly, Julian, given the relationship with the U.S. and for Jason and Michelle as well, I guess I'd just sort of like to ask the question broadly, which is we've been talking about various different market drivers of clean growth and what some of the both opportunities and barriers are. At a 30,000-foot level, how relevant is the outcome of the U.S. election to the future of clean growth? I mean, obviously, we've got a slew of Democratic candidates who have extraordinarily different views of this than President Trump does.
I think the stance on a lot of the technologies that Jason was talking about, I think actually there's a lot of commonality in terms of the US with the UK and other nations looking at some of the solutions for things like carbon capture and storage, for looking at technologies like hydrogen for some of the agricultural innovations. A lot of the power systems, nuclear, is going to be an important part of a system where you're you're going from a system that's 25% of the energy in the electricity system to something that may be 2-3 times that, you're going to need a lot of sources of generation. So I think there's actually quite a lot of commonality between the nations on attacking these business opportunities, which is the definition of clean growth. I think where it makes a big difference for the US stance is internationally. Clearly, in terms of driving forward the overall ambition, having a very engaged US is very, very helpful, whichever party it comes from, to actually trying to raise ambition. And I think that's the biggest opportunity, is the US to be able to stand with everybody to kind of raise ambition on all the dimensions we talked about.
And certainly I would imagine that will be one of the goals of your hosting of the UN COP26 in less than a year now.
Yes, I mean, it's a big milestone. It's 5 years on since Paris. Obviously, the formal process is for everybody to come forward and to raise their individual ambitions in their nationally determined contributions and in their backup of the plans that stand behind those. But as important in our minds is all of the real world actors as well who are making that happen. So can we see advanced companies like Microsoft and Jinko raising the ambition of each of the sectors that contribute today to the carbon, and actually seeing if we can have coalitions of high ambition companies who will say, we think that we can get to net zero faster than 2050. We have it might be a moonshot, but we have at least the knowledge of how we might get there, and we're going to try and pull it in as much as possible. If we can show that that is the art of the possible across all the different sectors of the economy, then I think there's an opportunity to even encourage all of the state actors to raise their ambition. So it's as much about the real world economy as it is about the kind of national state-by-state contributions.
Thank you. And apologies for anyone watching or in the audience. I slipped into jargon. COP26 will be the next major United Nations climate change conference that the UK is the host of.
Kind of like a political convention with a trade show attached and like some kind of negotiations. If you've ever been there.
Sounds fun. Yeah.
Definitely. Will you be there?
I will. Microsoft will be there.
I can definitely get there more easily since it's in Glasgow.
The Crown Heights is the Crown Plaza is right across. That's the best hotel, right?
I'm definitely not going to promote any hotels.
Michelle and Jason, the same question to you. How for your clean growth plans, for your climate targets, and Jason, for your business and pushing some of these technologies deeper and deeper into the mainstream, how relevant is election 2020?
I mean, we've set our plan. I mean, it's about Microsoft, and it's about what we're doing with our customers and with our supply chain. So I think we're going to continue to go forward. There's a lot of focus on what the presidential election means for climate. I think we should all focus on what the conversation is happening today, right now in DC. And I think there's a changed conversation, especially when you go to Congress and there's a lot of people who are coming out from different corners trying to think about, how do I approach this issue? It might not be the way that others have approached it to date. I might not like the policies that are out there, but I know it's a problem. And are there different ways to approach it? And I think that is starting to happen in places that you wouldn't expect it in Congress. And so it's an interesting moment. I would also point to, the trajectory will be different depending on who's president. Trajectory will be different depending on what Congress we have. But in some ways that empowers people. It empowers people to have to step up and figure this out themselves, if it's states, if it's cities, if it's companies. And then you get to, some of the innovations we might not have had. And so this train is moving. People are taking action. What that action looks like and what the system together is going to depend on a lot of different variables.
I'll definitely say that even for the UK, where we have a very strict legislative framework and have very clear plans on each of the sectors, it's still crowdsourced. It's still crowdsourced to the cities, to the companies, to all the actors to actually try and find. We're going to be doing more on giving people more information for their own personal carbon footprint. What are you personally going to do to get to net zero, and when will that be? So all of these, I think, this is not a single actor that's going to solve this. It's everybody acting in cohort.
Yeah. From my standpoint, I think there's a different story depending on who wins, right? So I think on the Democrat side, and you're already seeing with the candidates, you're going to have a direct line from climate change to the development of technologies in support of it. I think that's very likely. I think on Republicans, one thing we have seen in engaging with this administration is a strong focus on economic competitiveness. And I think that to me is the story, right? Like, do you want to take the risk that as a nation that this is not how we're going to make energy in the next 100 years? Well, that's risky, right? And so that line and these emerging technologies like synthetic biology, right? I mean, the White House held a summit, right? I mean, they're pushing it. They're pushing quantum. They're pushing synthetic biology because they know these are key areas of strategic relevance to the country and they want them to happen. That's good. I mean, that's happening under this administration. Didn't happen under previous ones. So I think that it's not quite as simple, but I do think there's like different stories that would push it in either case. But it's just, we can't miss it.
Thank you. I wanted to move back to the audience. I think we've got someone in the front row here.
Thank you. This is so common, I'm almost embarrassed to ask. Are any of you familiar with the Ingashaba Dam on the Congo River that doesn't cross the river and lights up 5 cities for more than 30 years, the distance of LA to Houston, Texas, with no infrastructure? If we had 50 of these up and down the Mississippi River, we could build groundwater, we could flood control, we could make money off of it with sporting and fishing and swimming, recreational purposes. And America owns about 30% of the property in the people in America own about 30% of the property. So you could always make sure it's on government property so you wouldn't have not in my backyard. And then you could control on the Colorado River the flow of through the Grand Canyon, put flowers in the desert. You could put it on the Hudson River and not have blackouts in New York City. And how are you going to give power to all of your cars, vehicles?
No, I think it's
vehicles? As I said, I'm almost embarrassed to ask the question.
No, I think the question. Well, please answer it. But I also think it gets to a great point, which is that there's a basket of technologies that we're all very familiar with, that we all hear about all the time. Are there some, like hydropower, that are perhaps not as in the conversation as much as they should be?
So we consider hydro as part of our renewables. Microsoft has 100% goal to have renewables for our. Right, I'm getting to the hydro in general. The question for us, it's a renewable resource, and it's really enhanced the competitiveness of many regions where we operate. And it operates 24/7, and there are opportunities in storage as well. So they're interesting opportunities, considering all the other environmental considerations are addressed.
I would say just generally different assets. There are different renewable assets or different assets in each of the different countries, and so no plan that works for one country is going to work for every country. We noticed that we get less sun in the UK and get more wind. So we tended to put up wind farms. We would encourage people further south that they might want to think about solar.
Thank you. So we're starting out of time. I wanted to do a quick lightning round, but I wanted to also quickly announce that when we do wrap up, there is a reception with food and drink afterwards, so please don't everybody go, because there's a lot more conversation to be had, and with refreshments as well. But with that, just final question for everybody. What is the biggest myth, in your opinion, about the idea of clean growth and climate-friendly growth?
Sure. From my standpoint, it is that like we mentioned earlier, that their intention. That I think investing in these technologies is going to give people better products over time, and the countries that do it will be the ones that win the next century. The sacrifice footing is not the right footing.
Yeah. I was going to say that you can make money.
The myth is that
No, you can't make money.
Yeah.
I would say that the combination of the fact that there is a huge opportunity here, and people, as you say, the myth is that we're being forced into this. I think it is a big economic opportunity, but also more the precautionary. And say, what's to regret about having better cars, better lower cost power, better agriculture, more productive agriculture. Being able to support a larger population. All of these things are what's to regret.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the in-person audience, the online audience, and most of all, thank you to the panelists as well. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, yes. And yes, and there's a reception now as well, so.